9:17 a.m. on November 5, 1943, over the humid green hell of the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Frank Potts Riley felt his world compress into a single horrifying vibration. His P-38G Lightning, serial number 4212844, was dying, and it was taking him with it. He was in a 400-mile-per-hour dive, trying to shake a nimble Japanese Zero that had latched onto his tail. This was the textbook escape maneuver, the one advantage the heavy American fighter had: power diving. But the textbook was a lie. It was a suicidal tactic, and every pilot in the 475th Fighter Group knew it. The vibration started in the control stick, a violent shudder that felt like the plane's soul was tearing apart. Riley pulled back with all his strength, his knuckles white, his muscles screaming. Nothing happened. The stick was frozen solid, cemented in place. Outside his canopy, the Pacific Ocean rushed up to meet him, not as a blue expanse, but as a hard, final wall. This was the fatal flaw. It was a demon pilots called compressibility, a mysterious aerodynamic curse that grabbed the P-38 in a high-speed dive and simply refused to let go.
The engineers at Lockheed and the theorists at Wright Field had theories, of course. They wrote memos about airflow separation and shock waves forming on the wing. They blamed the tail assembly, strengthening it with every new model, but their solutions were conceived in clean laboratories, thousands of miles from the greasy, blood-soaked reality of the Pacific theater. For the men on the front line, these theories were meaningless. What was real was the growing list of names read out at the morning briefings. What was real was the quiet, hollowed-out look in the eyes of pilots who had seen their wingmen simply vanish into the sea without a word. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy and another, more insidious war against their own aircraft. The official doctrine was failing, and the price of failure was death. The atmosphere at the forward airbase on Guadalcanal was thick with a mixture of humid air, engine oil, and a quiet, gnawing despair. The mechanics felt as helpless as the pilots, patching up bullet holes on planes they knew were fundamentally flawed, sending boys up in machines with a built-in death sentence.
Into this crucible of fear and frustration stepped Technical Sergeant James "Gentleman" Mitchell. He wasn't a pilot or an engineer. He was a 32-year-old crew chief from rural Ohio, a man who understood machines not through formulas, but through his fingertips. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a farmer's pragmatic approach to problem solving. He got his nickname not from his manners, but because he treated his P-38s with a gentle reverence, listening to their engines like a doctor listening to a patient's heart. He had lost two of his pilots in the last month, two boys he'd shared cigarettes and stories with. Their deaths became a personal offense, a puzzle he felt compelled to solve. He spent his nights under the moonlight, long after the other mechanics had gone to their cots, poring over the wreckage of planes that had been recovered from the jungle. The official reports all pointed to tail failure, but Mitchell saw something else. It was a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that the high-paid engineers had missed it completely. He noticed that on the planes that had miraculously been pulled out of a dive at the last second, the rivets on the underside of the wings, just aft of the main spar, were strained, almost popped. The skin of the aluminum was subtly buckled. The tail looked fine. The problem wasn't at the back of the plane, it was the wing.
The eureka moment didn't come from a blueprint. It came one evening as he watched a gull land on a pier, its wings cupping the air, flaring at the last second to brake and control its descent. The bird wasn't changing its tail, it was changing the shape of its wings. The thought was so simple, so utterly contrary to established aeronautical engineering that it felt ridiculous. He broke every rule in the book. He wasn't an officer, he wasn't a designer, he had no authority to modify government property. But he also knew that the official channels, the reports that sat on desks for weeks, were useless. He needed to change the airflow over the wing during a dive. He needed to create a disturbance, something to break up the invisible shockwave that was freezing the controls. He scrounged a foot-long piece of scrap aluminum, hammered it into a narrow wedge, and attached it with a simple hinge to the underside of the wing on a junked P-38. He then ran a thin, high-tensile steel wire, piano wire to be exact, from the makeshift flap into the landing gear well. The idea was incredibly, stupidly simple. When the pilot lowered his landing gear a few inches, the wire would pull the flap down into the slipstream. Now, he needed a pilot. Not just any pilot, but one who was either brave enough or desperate enough to test a completely unauthorized and potentially lethal modification. He found his man in Captain Ben "Daredevil" Carter. Carter was a reckless, hard-drinking ace who had survived 2 compressibility dives through sheer dumb luck. He had seen the demon up close and lived to tell the tale, and the experience had left him with a fatalism that bordered on suicidal. When Mitchell approached him in the dead of night, sketching his idea on a dirty napkin, Carter just laughed. "A wire trick? Sergeant, you're either a genius or a fool. What have I got to lose? My plane's trying to kill me anyway. Bolt it on." They worked in secret, 2 conspirators in a hangar that smelled of oil and ozone, committing what the Army Air Forces would consider an act of high treason. They were waging their own war against the system. The price of failure was a court-martial, or more likely, a fiery crater in the jungle floor. But the potential reward was survival. It was a chance to finally fight the enemy, not the plane itself. The first test was the most detailed and vivid scene in the entire legend. On November 12th, Carter took his modified P-38, the Ohio Bell, up to 30,000 feet, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He radioed back to the tower, his voice a mask of calm. "Commencing test dive as per flight plan." He pushed the nose over. The twin engine screamed as the lightning gathered speed. 400 miles per hour, 450. The familiar, dreaded vibration began, rattling his teeth. The airframe groaned under the immense pressure. He tried the control stick, frozen solid. "Here it is, Jim," he whispered into his mask, "the wall." His gut twisted with the primal fear that had killed so many of his friends. He was a passenger in a multi-ton steel coffin. Doubts flooded his mind. He was trusting his life to a mechanic's hunch, to a piece of scrap metal and a length of wire. He reached for the landing gear handle, his hand trembling slightly. He moved it just an inch as Mitchell had instructed. He heard a faint thud from under the wings. Incredibly, it worked. The physical sensation was instantaneous and violent. It felt like the plane had hit a pocket of invisible gravel. The nose, which had been tucking under in its inexorable death plunge, immediately pitched up. The G-force slammed Carter down into his seat, and the control stick jumped back to life in his hand. He had control. He pulled back gently, and the P-38 responded, gracefully pulling out of the dive and leveling off over the sparkling blue water. He let out a yell, a raw, triumphant sound of pure, unadulterated relief that crackled over the radio. He had punched through the wall. He had met the demon and defeated it with a simple wire trick. He landed the plane with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. As he taxied back to the hangar, he saw Sergeant Mitchell standing alone, his hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look casual. Carter cut the engines, threw back the canopy, and gave the quiet mechanic a thumbs up that carried more weight than any metal. The secret was born.
Carter's immediate superior was Major John Egan, a weary but pragmatic squadron commander who had already written too many letters home to grieving parents. When Carter breathlessly explained what had happened, showing him the crude flaps under the wing, Egan's first instinct was to have them both arrested. It was the most flagrant violation of regulations he had ever seen. But then he looked at the kill board.
His squadron was losing pilots at an unsustainable rate. He was a man caught between the rigid, soulless system and the bloody reality of daily combat. He made a decision that would define his career. Officially, this conversation never happened, he told Carter and Mitchell, his eyes hard, and that device does not exist. But if any other pilots want this unofficial field modification, I expect your mechanics to know nothing about it after hours. He became the silent patron of the innovation. The first crack, the underground spread, began that very night. The legend of Carter's ghost dive circulated in hushed tones through the barracks and mess halls. A pilot telling his wingman, the wingman seeking out his own crew chief. The crew chiefs, in turn, found their way to Mitchell's hangar after dark, like acolytes seeking forbidden knowledge. Mitchell, patient and calm, would show them the design, sketching it on the hangar floor with a piece of chalk. There was no official order, no blueprint, no supply chain. It was a grassroots movement, a conspiracy of frontline soldiers armed with scrap metal, piano wire, and a shared will to survive. They called them Mitchell's Magic Flaps. Within 2 weeks, nearly a third of the squadron's P-38s had been secretly modified. The pilots developed a new swaggering confidence. They were no longer afraid of their own planes. They were members of a secret brotherhood, possessors of a trick that gave them an almost divine advantage over the enemy. They could now dictate the terms of any engagement.
The results were undeniable and immediate. On a fighter sweep near Rabaul, a flight of 4 modified P-38s engaged a superior force of 12 Zeros. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to seeing the Lightnings avoid steep dives, were utterly bewildered. Carter and his wingmen did the one thing they weren't supposed to be able to do. They initiated vertical dives, plunging straight through the Japanese formations. The Zero pilots followed, anticipating an easy kill. But instead of auguring into the sea, the P-38s recovered instantly at the bottom of the dive, pulling up to slice into the now exposed bellies of the Japanese fighters. The short, sharp, energetic sentences of the after-action report told the story. 4 P-38s engaged, 8 Zeros destroyed, 0 American losses. It was a massacre. The tactic was brutally effective. It was revolutionary, and officially, it didn't exist. The kill ratio of the squadron, which had been a grim 1-to-1, suddenly skyrocketed. The legend was growing with every triumphant return. The work itself became a ritual. After the last official maintenance checks were signed off, a shadow crew would emerge. They worked by the dim light of shielded bulbs, their faces illuminated in brief conspiratorial flashes. The clink of a wrench, the whine of a hand drill, these were the sounds of their secret war. One evening, a fresh-faced lieutenant, barely out of flight school, cornered Mitchell by a fuel drum. "Sergeant," he stammered, "I hear you're the man to see about the dive." Mitchell just gave him a slow, assessing look. He saw the kid's fear, the same fear he'd seen in the eyes of the pilots he'd lost. He simply nodded and said, "Leave your plan with me tonight, Lieutenant. She'll be a different girl in the morning." This small act of trust, repeated over and over, forged a bond between the pilots and the ground crews that no regulation could break. They were no longer just pilots and mechanics. They were co-conspirators in the business of survival, and their shared secret was the most valuable weapon they had.
The information reached the desk of Colonel Harrison the Hammer Cole, a high-ranking, pragmatic leader from 5th Air Force Command. Cole was a man who only cared about one thing: results. He had lost his own nephew, a promising young P-38 pilot, over New Guinea 6 months prior to an unexplained dive incident. That loss had turned the P-38's fatal flaw from a statistic to a personal vendetta. He didn't give a damn about protocol if it wasn't winning the war. He saw the anomalous statistics coming from the 475th and flew to Guadalcanal unannounced. He stormed into Major Egan's office and threw the report on his desk. "What the hell is going on in your squadron, Egan? Your kill ratio has tripled in a month. Are your pilots lying, or have they made a pact with the devil?" Egan, knowing his career was on the line, decided to trust his man. He told the colonel the truth. He told him about the fatal flaw, the mechanic's secret, and the underground modifications. Cole listened intently, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. This was the moment of confrontation, the ultimate clash between the man and the system. Colonel Cole demanded to see the device and meet its creator. Egan led him to the hangar, where Mitchell was calmly tightening a bolt on an engine. Alongside him was a civilian, a field representative from Lockheed named Henderson, who had flown in with the colonel. Henderson, a man in a crisp, clean khaki shirt, scoffed openly at the makeshift flap. "Colonel, I must protest," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is an unauthorized, untested, and frankly dangerous modification. Our engineers have run thousands of hours of wind tunnel tests, factory tolerances." Cole cut him off with a slice of his hand. "Your engineers and their tolerances are getting my pilots killed, Mr. Henderson." He turned to Mitchell. "Sergeant, does it work?" Mitchell looked not at the colonel, but at Captain Carter, who had just joined them. "Ask him, sir. He's the one who flies it." Carter's response was cold and clear. "It's the only reason I'm standing here today, Colonel."
Cole made his decision. "I'm flying it." Henderson paled. "Colonel, that's insane. It voids the warranty. It's not on any approved list." Cole just smiled a grim, humorless smile. "Son, the only list I care about is the casualty list." He put on a flight suit and climbed into the Ohio Bell. The entire base held its breath. They watched the silver speck climb to 30,000 feet and then tip over into a terrifyingly steep dive. He pushed the plane faster than anyone had dared before, to the absolute edge of its performance envelope. He felt the controls freeze, the airframe shake, the full, horrifying power of compressibility. It was the monster that had killed his nephew. Then he actuated the makeshift flaps. The recovery was so immediate, so decisive, it felt like a miracle. He landed, taxied directly to the control tower, and climbed out of the cockpit. He strode past the sputtering Henderson and stood before Sergeant Mitchell, the quiet mechanic. He stared at him for a long, silent moment. "You did this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Mitchell replied. The colonel turned to Egan. "Get me a line to headquarters, now." That afternoon, he issued a direct, unambiguous order that cut through months of bureaucratic red tape and engineering debates. "Effective immediately," his telex read, "all P-38 aircraft in this theater are to be equipped with dive recovery flaps based on the field modification developed by the 475th Fighter Group. Technical specifications to follow. And let me be clear," he added in a personal addendum, "any officer who attempts to discipline any soldier involved in the development of this life-saving innovation will answer to me personally." It was a complete and total victory for the unsung genius. The system had been defeated by common sense and courage. The irrefutable numbers sealed the deal. Within 3 months of the fleet-wide modification, the P-38 survival rate in a combat dive increased by an astonishing 90%. The kill ratio against the Zero shifted decisively in America's favor. The Lightning was finally the plane it was always meant to be.
And what of the hero's fate? Technical Sergeant James Mitchell received no Medal of Honor, no Distinguished Service Cross. He was quietly transferred to a maintenance depot in the rear, officially to assist in the standardization of the new flap design, but unofficially to remove the living embodiment of the system's failure from the front lines. After the war, he did not become a famous engineer or a wealthy inventor. He returned to his modest life in Ohio. He opened a small Ford dealership, raised a family, and became just another face in the crowd of veterans who had come home. Years later, a young customer brought in a sputtering coupe he couldn't fix. Mitchell listened to the engine for a moment, then walked over to his toolbox, grabbed a simple cotter pen worth less than a nickel,
and inserted it into a rattling linkage. The engine purred to life. The young man was amazed. "How did you know?" he asked. Mitchell just wiped his greasy hands on a rag and smiled. Sometimes the simplest fix is the right one. His name was never mentioned in the official histories written by Lockheed or the Air Force. No one knows his name now, but his invention had an eternal life. The simple, elegant principle of Mitchell's magic flaps became a foundational element of high-speed aircraft design. The concept saved pilots again in the skies over Korea, flying F-86 Sabres, whose swept wings created their own unique high-speed demons. It saved them again in Vietnam, embedded in the designs of the F-4 Phantom and the F-105 Thunderchief. It became an unwritten standard, a piece of anonymous genius baked into the DNA of nearly every jet fighter that followed. The legend of the simple wire trick, the story of how a humble mechanic outsmarted 1,000 engineers, was never recorded in the history books. It lived on only in the stories told by the old pilots, a secret passed down to their sons and grandsons, a testament to a forgotten truth. Officially, the problem was solved by a team of corporate engineers, but the men who were there, the men who felt the stick freeze in their hands, they knew the real story.
The moral of this story is as simple and powerful as the invention itself. History is not forged in the high offices of generals or the pristine laboratories of distant corporations. It is not made by systems, by committees, or by regulations. It is hammered out in the mud and grease of the front lines, by ordinary people who see a problem with their own eyes and dare to break the rules to solve it. It is made by the quiet, observant few who possess the courage to trust their own hands and their own minds against the crushing weight of accepted doctrine. Wars are won by the unsung genius who, in a moment of desperate clarity, realizes that a simple piece of wire can be more powerful than 1,000 pages of official orders. That is the legend. The real tribute to James Mitchell isn't a statue or a medal. It's the generations of pilots who came home safely, never knowing they owed their lives to a quiet mechanic from Ohio and his simple, brilliant, and utterly forbidden idea. The most poignant postscript to the legend came years later at an air show in the 1970s. An aging Ben Carter, now a civilian, stood before a perfectly restored P-38 Lightning. A young, eager aviation historian was explaining the plane's features, pointing to the underside of the wing. And these, the historian said authoritatively, are the famous dive recovery flaps, a brilliant piece of late-war engineering from the Lockheed Skunk Works that solved the compressibility problem. Carter listened, a faint, sad smile on his lips. He ran a hand over the smooth, riveted metal of the flap, a perfectly manufactured version of the crude device he and Mitchell had bolted on in the dead of night. He knew the truth. He knew it wasn't born in a high-tech lab. It was born out of desperation, in a sweltering hangar, from the mind of a man whose name was now lost to the winds of time. Carter simply nodded at the young historian. "Is that so?" he said quietly, and walked away, leaving the official story to echo in the hangar, while the real one remained where it always was, a secret, held by the few who were there.